So for the rest of today, we'll talk about kind of one of the other halves of the European Middle Ages. Now I've kind of laid a political history kind of foundation, groundwork. So we'll talk about how religion gets involved with all this, and especially how religious leaders try to propose solutions for all this chaos, all this violence that seems epidemic in European society. And we've talked about all this on this slide so far. So just a kind of quick reminder, feudalism becomes an attempt at social stability and political stability, economic stability. But in a lot of ways it really fails. It creates a system of even more violence, even more epidemic violence, or a motivation for violence amongst the counts and lords and knights. How primogeniture created unemployed younger sons that are militarily trained, which is always kind of dangerous in society. You don't want your military veterans feeling desperate because they can people that are used to violence can turn to violence to start careers in it. So we've talked about all this stuff at length earlier. And the leaders of Christianity, they try to come up with some way of motivating people to be more peaceful. So they'll use the religious message and threats about going to hell and whatnot for committing violent acts against defenseless people. And they'll try all kinds of different statements really to see what works, and they'll try to scale up what works as much as possible. So one of the first ones they come up with comes known as the peace of God, and that basically says that trained armed knights cannot fight unarmed people, peasants. It becomes illegal in God's eyes. Like, God will punish knights that go out and victimize and brutalize just average working people. So the peace of God says that knights can only fight other knights. And they obviously don't want them fighting counts and lords, because that's assassination. Does that make sense? And of course the counts and lords try to enforce this to try to put some kind of limitations on what knights are allowed to do. It doesn't always work, because a lot of these knights still they conspire to go after counts and lords to try to promote themselves. But a lot of knights do start following this idea that at least they're not supposed to be attacking defenseless peasants. So that reduces the violence just out there in European society a little bit. And another becomes known as the Truce of God, which is basically that the church has all these holidays on the calendar. And what are the most important holidays in Christianity? Christmas is one of the big ones, but not the big one. What's the big one? Easter. So that's the day of celebrating the resurrection. So the church makes it basically illegal to fight on these religious days, these holy days, which are basically what holidays are. And that one works really well. When knights and lords and whatnot, they're told that they'll go to hell for attacking and killing and causing violence on Easter or Good Friday or Christmas Day, they actually avoid it. They don't commit violent acts on those days. So what does the church do next?
Make a bunch of holidays.
Yeah, they increase the amount of holidays. So all these new holidays start popping up all over the calendar to try to clamp down on the violence as much as possible, to make it illegal on more days so that the violence is somehow controllable. A lot of those kind of secondary religious days are not followed as strictly as the big ones like Christmas and Easter and whatnot. The Truce of God also says that you should not be fighting in religious places, which are largely in Europe churches themselves and the homes of religious leaders. And that one seems to work pretty well, because it just becomes an idea within European society that anyone who kills someone else in a church is automatically going to hell, no matter anything else they do in their life. So that one works so well that a lot of knights, when they're kind of traveling around and they see that their enemies are following them, what do those knights do? They look for the local church as fast as they can, and they try to get inside that building because they hope at least that the enemies are not going to try to kill them inside the building. So if they find the local church and they get inside, the religious people running the church often give them shelter and food and whatnot. What do the enemies often do? They just go home?
Wait outside?
Yeah, they set up camp outside the church and wait for the guy to come walking out so they can kill him then. So this ends up being like a standoff, sometimes right at the steps leading up to the church door. And sometimes it'll go on for days and weeks. Just waiting for the guy to come out. So you still get that every once in a while. And it becomes a kind of popular idea within Europe throughout the Middle Ages. And if you're afraid of being attacked, get to the church as fast as you can. So, questions about those at all? So you see how the kind of theoretical ideas have real-world kind of ripple effects in everyday life. But the big ones, though, are the Crusades. These are the big ideas that the Christian church leaders come up with to try to solve the problem of violence in Europe. And the Crusades have several kind of big goals. The big obvious one is that Christian leaders in Europe basically start giving speeches, and we'll talk about a few of them real briefly. But the general idea is that the Muslims have conquered the eastern Mediterranean coastline, including Jerusalem and some of the kind of holy sites where Christianity started. That's part of the Muslim empires. And there's several different Muslim kingdoms that are all interacting with each other. So at this point, there's not one unified king of all this territory. There's many kingdoms, just like there's many Christian kingdoms in Europe. And those Muslim kingdoms fight against each other over land and resources and whatnot. But the European idea is Muslims have control over the Holy Lands, as the Europeans call it. And so the Europeans should get all these extra knights and counts and all these people that are used to fighting, professional soldiers, get them together and build up like this giant European Christian army to travel down through Constantinople and then attack down into Anatolia, which is Muslim-held territory, and get to Jerusalem and so-called liberate the Holy Lands from Muslim control. Does that make sense? And a secondary idea is that this will help clamp down on the violence in Europe because you're going to get rid of all those extra knights and you're going to send them somewhere else. All these guys that are causing the violence in Europe will now leave Europe and go out and occupy the Holy Lands. So there won't be as much violence in Europe. Does that make sense? You take all those violent people and get them the hell out of town. Send them somewhere else. Let them go fight somewhere else. Is that clear? All right. But this idea of crusades, the big ones get going in the late 1000s. But there were crusade-type ideas already floating around in Europe, especially in Iberia, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal. That is already controlled by Muslim kingdoms, at this point called the Moorish kingdoms. That's because the Muslims, to go back to the map, bigger map for a second, the Muslim empires had conquered across North Africa in the 700s, and then in the early 700s had attacked across the so-called Strait of Gibraltar, way out to the top left corner of this map, and had attacked modern-day Spain, Iberia, and conquered it in the early 700s. And they still hold it by the 1000s. It's still part of a Muslim kingdom. So even by the 800s, there's already ideas starting to float around in Europe about a religious kind of holy crusade to kick the Muslims out of Europe and push them back out into North Africa. So Iberia is a big part of that. So there's like this crusade idea, the word crusade is already floating around in Europe, largely directed at Iberia at this point, before the official big crusades to go after Jerusalem get going. So it's a term that's already fairly well known to religious people and military people in Europe that pay attention to this stuff. And Christian armies will attack into Iberia to try to kick the Muslims out, but that fails, and they'll try over and over and over again through the 1400s. So this is a process that goes on for hundreds of years, and is eventually successful in 1492. And that's where a country of Spain is kind of proclaims its independence and becomes a European country. Does that make sense? Questions about that at all? So that's one area they're already talking about crusades. Another one, Muslims have attacked and are controlling Sicily, this island just down here in the middle of the Mediterranean. So that's a Muslim-held territory, and the idea of crusade is also kind of floated to build up a European Christian army to attack Sicily and kick the Muslims out of there. So the word crusade is already fairly popular, well known in military circles in Europe. But the big one, the big idea of crusade really gets going to get the Holy Lands. Really, when the Byzantine Empire, the leftover of the old Roman Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, at first they had controlled Anatolia, this big peninsula to the east of Constantinople. Constantinople's right here, smack in the middle. And over the decades, the Muslim kingdoms had attacked the Byzantine Empire and gained control over a lot of this peninsula, Anatolia. And the Byzantine emperor at Constantinople asked the Pope to help gather together a European Christian army to attack the Muslims in Anatolia and take it back for the Byzantines. Does that make sense? So again, the idea is floating around in all these different areas around Europe, kind of on the European borders, about this idea of crusade to take back certain land from Muslim political leaders. And sometimes the attacks happen, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. It's really kind of hit or miss for the Europeans. But this suggestion seems to really get the Pope's ear. And it's 1089. I can't remember the exact year. I have it written down somewhere. But the Pope, Urban II, proposes in a sermon officially that European soldiers should come together in a religious mission to not just go after Anatolia, but to conquer down into the eastern Mediterranean and take back Jerusalem and the so-called Holy Lands. And the Pope has several layers of motivation that historians have argued about over the years about why he would want this to happen. Number one is there is what was called the Great Schism at this point already going on in Europe. It's really a religious debate between Western European Christians and Eastern European Christians about the exact nature of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So they're arguing about that already. And there are threats every once in a while of one group or the other to break away from the official church and start a new movement. So there's a possibility of the unified Christian church splitting in half. And some historians argue that the Pope suggests this crusade in order to bring them all back together again under one project that they can all agree on. This sounds good to both sides. Does it make sense? Another problem with the schism is that there's another guy claiming to be Pope. And so Urban II is arguing against that guy, trying to retain the official position for himself. So proposing that all Christians come together and go off on this mission that God sent us to go conquer the Holy Lands, or to liberate the Holy Lands, makes the Pope, Urban II, makes him look like the official leader of all Christianity. At least human leader. And maybe if people recognize him as that, they'll forget about the other guy that's claiming to be a leader. And of course, as we already talked about, it's an opportunity to get all these extra soldiers, all these knights running around in Europe, causing the epidemic violence, get them together in one massive army and send them somewhere else. Then the violence in Europe will end. Question?
Won't that leave Europe vulnerable to outside attacks?
That's one problem. Send all your armies somewhere and they might get attacked somewhere else. There's another fairly clear problem with this idea of just get them out of town. They're going to come back someday. They might come back even more violent, even more bloodthirsty and cutthroat than they had left. So is that really a long-term solution? So, yeah. So that's the question I always raise. What happens when the war is over and people come home? Is they supposed to stay out there forever? I don't know. Other questions? No? All good? Oh, ready? Okay. 1095. Yeah, that's it. So Urban II gives this big sermon in a town called Clermont in France. And the sermon proposes that the Europeans get together this massive Christian army and they go out and conquer the Holy Lands. And it's an extremely popular message. Basically, he tells the Europeans, if you volunteer to go off and fight for this, God will forgive you for all the sins you've committed in your life so far. God will protect your property back home, so even if you kind of leave, if you're a count or a lord or something, you leave your territory and you go off on this crusade, that no one's allowed to take your land from you while you're gone, even if you're gone for years, come back eventually and it'll still be there for you. And that any new sins you commit will be forgiven by God. And what kind of sins can you imagine soldiers committing in warfare? Murder. Yeah, they're going to be killing people.
Rape.
Yeah, probably rape. They're going to be stealing property. There's going to be theft. And there's going to be all kinds of horrible things. I mean, war is a horrible type of thing to do. And the Pope says that God forgives you in advance for all those bad things you're about to do when you launch the invasion. Especially if it's violence against Muslims. Because the Pope says they're basically infidels, they've turned their back on God, and they're God's not going to be angry if you kill him. And that's another reason that the Europeans love this idea. There seems to, where's the downside for them? For the Europeans at least, right? Because even if you get killed on the battlefield, what's going to happen to you?
You go to heaven.
You go to heaven because you're fighting for God, right? Does that make sense? So it's a win-win-win. You're either going to win the battle and you're going to gain some lands and you can get rich by stealing and you can kill the enemy and you can go back home and keep the land that you had before. But if you get killed on the battlefield, you immediately go to heaven. Where's the downside? So it's an extremely popular message throughout all of Europe. And the Pope, after this sermon, there's such a positive reaction to the people who heard it that they have it printed up and distributed throughout churches all throughout Europe. And the Pope actually goes on tour. He goes to one city after another giving the same sermon over and over again, and everyone loves it. So this creates a whole movement of people beyond just his original message that the idea of these crusades will last long beyond Urban's own lifetime. And this idea will keep reappearing in Europe, will keep popping up for centuries. So there's going to be many crusades. And the painting up at the top is famous painting of Urban kind of showing up at the church, and then in the next panel giving the sermon. So it's kind of like a comic book depicting time and events, right? Different panels. You've seen comic books before? You're aware that comic books exist? Okay. All right. So this idea is so wildly popular in Europe. Urban wants the kind of big leaders, the big counts and kings and whatnot of Europe to really organize this thing, but it actually gets out of hand. There's one guy, becomes known as Peter the Hermit, who starts preaching himself, who's kind of a homeless guy, and he travels from town to town and says that he's been given a revelation from God that it's actually the peasants of Europe that are supposed to do this. It's not the knights and the trained soldiers. So a bunch of peasants start following this guy, Peter the Hermit, and they go from town to town and their numbers grow. And Peter's message is basically, we're going to go kill all the infidels. And he seems to intend that the infidels are Muslims in the Holy Lands. But a lot of his followers, as their numbers grow, they kind of turn into a big mob that's going from town to town in Europe, slowly making their way toward Constantinople, toward southeastern Europe. A lot of them seem to interpret infidels also meaning Jews. So in many towns, they massacre the Jewish population of those areas in Europe. So the idea has gotten out of hand, and violence is even greater than it was before the sermon in the first place. So it's just kind of marauding waves of mass murder. Of course, Jewish groups go into hiding and they try to escape it as much as they can. So you can already see a kind of heavy anti-Semitism within European Christianity even this early on. Let's see. Yeah, and eventually Peter and his big group of thousands and thousands of European peasants, they get to Constantinople. They kind of resupply. The Byzantine government's really in favor of this stuff because they'll give money and supplies to anyone who's willing to attack the Muslim armies. And then they come out of Constantinople and they go into Anatolia and they attack a professional Muslim army. And what happens to them? They get annihilated because these are farmers that don't know how to fight. They don't really have a lot of weapons. And they're going up against trained, seasoned professional troops. And they get wiped out. The peasants seem to believe that they had God on their side and that God would intervene to help them. And they're basically wiped off the battlefield pretty easily when God did not intervene. So they're a little shocked by that. But that doesn't stop the crusade idea. Basically, the kings of Europe and the Pope says, well, those were like unprofessional. They weren't organized. They didn't know what they're doing. So the crusading, the official First Crusade, still gets going a couple years later in 1099, and they do build up a lot of professional, trained knights. And they go through Constantinople and they attack down into Anatolia and they win battles against the Muslim forces, largely because the Muslims are fighting amongst each other. There's many different Muslim kingdoms around this area. And they eventually make it all the way down to the eastern Mediterranean, conquering lands, and they attack Jerusalem. And they conquer Jerusalem in summer of 99. And they say they have liberated the Holy Lands. So the Europeans conquer all of Anatolia, basically, and down into the coastline. and they try to occupy the place for the long term. They set up new governments, what come to be known as client states, basically puppet governments, especially along the coastline, to control this so that Christians can come on pilgrimage down to Jerusalem and not have to worry about crossing into Muslim kingdoms or being attacked by Muslim armies. One giant problem, though, even in this first crusade, which has the most success of any crusade, the Europeans don't trust each other. These counts and kings and lords and knights, when they conquer territory, they start fighting amongst themselves about who should govern it. And even small territories, individual towns and little pieces of the countryside. So the European First Crusade is not very well organized, and they don't trust each other, and they start fighting each other over land throughout Anatolia and the whole coastline. Does that make sense? So in reality, they've taken their feudalism system with all its inherent violence and just kind of exported it to this area. And violence replicates itself. And it starts again. And when several Muslim kingdoms come together and unite and organize themselves, they launch a counterattack first at Edessa, which is up there in the north, to try to cut off the rest of these European kingdoms from resupply. And piece by piece, this Muslim counterattack takes decades. Eventually, they retake the whole coastline and reconquer Jerusalem and kick the Europeans out. Does that make sense? So the First Crusade succeeded for a while until the Muslim kingdoms kind of figure out how to organize themselves and launch a counterattack. So the Europeans come up with a Second Crusade. So it's over the next 30 years after the Muslims have counterattacked. The Second Crusade is largely organized by the French king and some German kings. They do basically the same thing. They go through Constantinople, and then they, in the end, they launch a naval attack to try to get to Jerusalem. And the Second Crusade retakes Jerusalem. And then the Muslims counterattack again under their big leaders named Saladin. And the textbooks will often say he organized the Muslim kingdoms, or he united them or something like that. He's really a pretty brutal type of monarch and really destroys anyone who opposes him. So the Muslims get behind him, often not by choice. And they launch a counterattack in the late 1100s, and they retake Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is going back and forth for about 100 years in the first two crusades. And the Muslim counterattack. Does that make sense? So neither side can really control the place for the long term, at least in the first 100 years. So by 1190, the Muslims have control over the Holy Lands again. So what do the Europeans do? They try to get back together and launch a third crusade. This one is largely organized by the English king Richard I, and he tries to get the French king involved and some German kings involved. But this is really Richard's kind of project. This one runs into problems almost immediately. Number one, the big German king named Frederick, he starts traveling down with his army. Well, when they go to cross a river, the king's boat capsizes and he drowns. So Frederick is out. And the Germans think this is a bad sign, so they kind of break down amongst themselves and some of them go back home. Richard, the English king, tries to sail all the way to get to at least the area around Jerusalem with his army to launch a naval attack. And he's expecting the French and the German kings to launch a land-based attack on Jerusalem. But the German king's dead, or one of the German kings, and the French king thinks that if the English king is out of this country, this is a good opportunity to attack England. So the French king ends up staying home and trying to gain as much land from England as he possibly can. So again, the Europeans are fighting amongst themselves. So the only guy who, the only army that really arrives to try to attack is the English guy, his army, and they attack, but they fail. And let's see. Yeah, there's a king. Picture of the king. Richard I is often called the Lion-Hearted because he took leadership of this crusade movement. But his invasion failed, and he spends the rest of his time basically trying to get back home. He's traveling through mainland Europe. He gets kidnapped, and the kidnappers try to ransom him back to the English government. But while Richard I is gone out of England, his younger brother, Prince John, is running England itself. And this is where you get the Robin Hood story, right? The evil King John, who's a tyrant and oppressive of the people. Sound familiar? And the people just want their good King Richard to come back home and get rid of this younger brother who's running the place badly. You guys have seen Robin Hood movies? Yeah. So what usually happens at the end of the Robin Hood movie?
They kill the king, or John, I think.
Well, they usually, I guess it depends which one you're watching. I haven't seen the most recent one. But usually the end of the other movies, the king comes back. The king arrives in England, Richard, and he basically yells at his younger brother and says, "You really screwed this up." And Richard I kind of takes over the government again, and everything's all right. Because he's like a good, honorable type of guy. That didn't happen. Richard I, he never gets back home. He tries to raise an army to re-attack France, but he eventually dies. So he never really gets back to England. And so Prince John becomes King John. And he'll be king for the rest of his life. And he continues running England into the ground. He's not a very good king on any level, or maybe for his own kind of greedy self. But he causes a lot of problems in taxation and really oppressing people who speak out against him. To the point that the counts and the lords of England trap him one day, and they force him to sign what they call the Grand Charter, in Latin a Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which is basically a document that says the king is giving these rights to the people, that they cannot be, jailed without having a criminal charge brought against them. They can't be basically kind of executed without being convicted of a crime, without evidence. Their homes cannot be searched without a warrant, all kinds of things. So the Magna Carta is often seen as a first kind of early European government statement of some amount of what we today call natural rights, human rights that people have, that even the king cannot kind of overstep. Does it make sense? And why did the king sign this?
Nobody killed him.
Yeah, they told him, "You're going to sign this paper, or I'll kill you." So he signed the paper. And the idea of those natural rights, it becomes pretty solidified in England for the most part. So that even by the 14 and 1500s, there's an expectation amongst the English people that they have these certain rights that even the king cannot throw in the trash. So it becomes kind of institutionalized within their laws and their society. And that's the beginning of a slow transition toward more kind of equality and democracy. That's largely a story for History 6. Let's see. So the Third Crusade, though, fails. Right? Richard I didn't reconquer the Holy Land. So eventually, in the early 1200s, a fourth crusade is proposed. And several monarchs get involved in this in England. Their big problem, though, is that they don't have enough money. They need cash to pay the soldiers and get the resources and the food and the weapons and all this stuff together to launch the invasions. So the Fourth Crusade leaders, as they're moving their soldiers through Europe, they stop off in Venice, which is in northern Italy, to raise money. And Venice is its own kingdom. So the leaders of Venice said, okay, we'll give you a bunch of money as long as you do something for us. And that is the thing they want done, is to put a guy from Venice on the throne of the Byzantine Empire. Because the Byzantine Empire was doing things that the leaders in Venice didn't like. So they want to replace him. So the leaders of the Fourth Crusade say, okay, we'll take your money. They take on the guy from Venice, and they go to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, and they have this guy from Venice crowned the new king of the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine government and a lot of the Byzantine population doesn't like this, and so they overthrow the so-called Venetian candidate. And the Fourth Crusade, in order to keep the money flowing from Venice, they attack Constantinople, conquer the city, burn a big part of it, and try to, control the place. So, in that effort, which in the end fails, the Byzantine emperors come back. The Fourth Crusade never gets out of Constantinople. They never actually attack Anatolia or get down into the Jerusalem neighborhood at all. They get bogged down in Constantinople. So the Fourth Crusade can't even really get going. Does that make sense? And they do such damage to Constantinople that many historians say that this really weakens the Byzantine Empire to the point that after these crusades kind of peter out. The later big Muslim empire, the Ottoman Empire, will start launching counterattacks. And now that Constantinople is weakened, the Muslims can conquer the city, which they do in the mid-1400s. So the Fourth Crusade destroyed their own protection, basically, because Constantinople is seen as like the solid rock that's going to stop the Muslim invasions of Europe. And by invading Constantinople, they destroy its defenses, or a whole lot of it, which opens an opportunity for the Muslims to invade at some point. And once they conquer Constantinople in the 1400s, then they'll launch out from there. They rename it Istanbul on this map, and they'll start attacking the rest of Eastern Europe, and they'll continue doing so for hundreds of years. So Europe is open to constant invasion from the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, for hundreds and hundreds of years after this Fourth Crusade. So that's a long-term effect of that. So that's going pretty far into History 6. Questions about that? Modern Western history. And the Crusades don't even stop there. After about the Fourth Crusade, there are several other attempts, but they're usually not like unified of major European kings. There's like attempts by some kings and attempts by other kings. So especially after the Fourth Crusade, you start getting all these numbers. And it starts getting really confusing because some textbooks will call one movement an official crusade and other textbooks won't. So the numbers stop lining up really well with each other, depending on which books and which documentaries and whatnot you're accessing. Does that make sense? So the Fourth Crusade is the last kind of solid one that we can put a number on. And after that, historians argue what other of these movements are official crusades and what's just like a splinter movement. And there's one called the Children's Crusade. And guess what that is? Bunch of kids. This one starts off in French countryside, where this kid about, I think he's supposed to be like 13 or 14 years old, named Stephen, much like the Joan of Arc story. He's out there with his family in the farmland, out in the countryside, and starts saying that God came to him and gave him a great message. And the message is that Stephen should try to gather together as many children from Europe as possible. And I think the oldest is only like 14 or 15. And the children of Europe should come together and they should go to the ocean at this place called Marseille, which is in southern France. And when they go down to the shoreline, right on the Mediterranean Sea, God will part the sea, just like the Moses story, and the children will walk from southern France all the way to Jerusalem. And God will open the city to them, and they will take the city and reclaim it for Christianity. Why children? Why do people believe this? And a lot of people believe this. So a mob of not just children, but their family members, like supporting them, trying to get them to the shoreline. Why do they do this? Why do they believe this?
Because they won't harm children.
Yeah, because children are pure. They have like God's essence and all those kinds of things. So children are uncorrupted. And God will help them. So huge mob of children. They eventually get to Marseille. And they go down to the shoreline. And what happens? Does God part the sea? No. They get down to the beach, right to the water, nothing happens. So a lot of them are pretty disappointed. Right? Some of them traveled hundreds of miles. And what do they do at this point? A lot of them start talking about going home, they're disillusioned. But then some wealthy French businessmen who have some boats say, we totally believe this, so if God didn't part the sea, that's okay. We'll give the kids, I think it's 7 large vessels, 7 ships. So that the children can get on the boats, and God will bring them across the sea to Jerusalem. So, they all start loading up on 7 ships. It's a children's crusade, so no adults allowed. And they set sail, and they go out into the sea, and never heard from again. Yep. So we don't know what happened to those 7 ships. We know that they set sail. This is a real story. This happened. About 20 years later, one guy shows up in France and claims to have been one of the children on the boats. And he has an interesting story. He said that, yeah, we set sail, and then we ran into a storm, 3 of the boats crashed, they're shipwrecked, and those kids probably all died. The rest of the 4 then continue sailing, and as they get close to North Africa, they're captured by North African pirates, and basically all sold into slavery throughout North Africa. And this guy says that I was enslaved for 20 years, and my owner in North Africa let me go and sent me back to Europe to tell the story, so that the Europeans would know what happened to their kids. We don't know if that story is true. That's what this guy was saying. Could have been a guy that came up with this story and realized that a lot of people would buy him dinner and free drinks when he goes from town to town to tell the story. We don't know if it's true, but that's really the best amount of evidence on any level that we have for what happened to these kids. So that's the Children's Crusade. Didn't work out too well. And obviously the Muslim kingdoms are still in control of Jerusalem. So they keep going though. There's more crusades that get proposed, and eventually they all fail. So some textbooks will talk about 9 crusades or 12 crusades. I mean, it's really a kind of scattering of different numbers. Like I said, especially after the 4th. Most sources talk about the 4th pretty consistently. So was the Children's Crusade an official one? Should it have a number? Or is it just like this weird offshoot that isn't official? And historians still debate this even today. The main problem seems to be, though, that the European Crusaders did not trust each other. That even when they win battles and conquer land, they start fighting over each other about who should own the land and govern the land and who should profit off the land. So they're constantly bickering amongst each other. And that seems to destroy any ability to control or occupy the place for the long term. And in the end, the violence in Europe just keeps going. So the Crusades did not accomplish any of their goals. Outside of the First and Second Crusades, they controlled Jerusalem for a little while, but they eventually lose it. And there's all kinds of bloodshed, especially the First Crusade. Reportedly, when they conquered Jerusalem, they massacred every Muslim they could find. So it's massively violent. And a lot of people living in that part of the world remember this and call what Europeans do today in that part of the world is basically modern crusades trying to control the land for the long term. Like the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, if you listen to the news sources coming out of that part of the world, they're almost all calling this a new crusade. So I had long-term memory, and makes sense for them to remember such a thing because it's massively violent and upsetting. So questions about the Crusades at all? Nope. All right. Last part is religion's effect, especially on education. This eventually becomes known as scholasticism. Going back to the early 1000s, really the only big the only big schools being built throughout Europe are run by the church, the Unified Christian Church, the Pope's Church. They're on the local level. They're mostly monasteries, and often the students take vows of silence and they, study intellectual stuff and study parts of the Bible and whatnot. So education within the monastery system, going back to the early 1000s, is mostly controlled by the church. The most popular book is the Bible, and that's what people are learning to read and write out of. So they're copying Bible verses. So education was mostly controlled by the church. It was a religious education. By about the mid-1000s or so, you start getting more secular schools, more independent of the church. And a lot of these are not built with big buildings or anything, but a lot of them are kind of local teachers who start organizing schools, and they start holding class wherever they can get a room in, even hotels or pubs or bars or any kind of place, or a large room in someone's house. Anywhere. So these local schools start gaining very strong reputations because they're not just teaching religious ideas, they're teaching more secular ideas. So there's a lot of criticism and questioning, and they especially start going back to ancient texts, especially coming out of ancient Greece. So they'll start studying things like Plato and Aristotle and whatnot again. It's where this stuff is kind of rediscovered in Europe. Does that make sense? Yes? No? All right. The problem, though, for the secular schools, the religious schools run by the church, they have a certain amount of protection because they're basically the Pope's employees, and the Pope has political contacts with all these kings, and he can make deals to stop these monasteries from being attacked politically from knights and soldiers and whatnot. These secular schools don't have any protection. They're not affiliated with the church, and they're not usually run by government either. So if they start studying things or assigning readings that are critical of whatever local king or count or whatever, that could really put them in a bad position where the political leaders, the wealthy of the area, might want to take them out, just get rid of them, because they're spreading dangerous ideas. Does that make sense? So the faculty, groups of teachers start getting together and trying to organize themselves for their own protection. And this gets involved with economics, where a lot of these more secular schools, they start calling themselves what we would today say call university. Universitas is a Latin term for like the bringing together of teachers and students. So that's the beginning of our word for university. And the faculty, the teachers, sometimes just 2 or 3 teachers in 1 or 2 different rooms, in order to defend themselves politically, they don't have weapons, they're not trained, so they realize that their strength is economic. These schools, even on small scale villages and towns, they start getting such a good reputation for educating people. Like the students who graduate from some of these schools go on and work for governments, they start their own businesses, they get wealthy and powerful. So a lot of wealthy families want to send their kids to these schools. Does that make sense? To get their children well trained and educated so they can continue the family's prosperity. So a lot of wealthy families start sending their kids to these schools. And when you get younger people gathering together in a town, their families want them to be well supplied, and they're rich. So these kids come into these little universities with money. And so those kids will rent out nice hotel rooms, or they'll rent out a room in a local rich person's house. And they're paying rent. They're spending money. They buy a lot of food. They buy a lot of wine. They buy a lot of clothes. They're contributing to the local economy. Does that make sense? To the point where a lot of towns, their whole economic development is built around these schools. You see that? They're building up the local economy. Suddenly the farmers have rich customers to buy their food and their wine, or their clothes, or their tables, or whatever they're selling. So these faculty groups will use that economic threat. They'll basically say, unless the local king or the count protects us, we'll just pick up our school and move it somewhere else. So they don't have official buildings. They haven't built anything. All they have to do is decide, okay, we're going to be offering classes 10 miles to the east. Then all the students have to pick up and move all their stuff. The money leaves town and the community's bankrupted. You see how that operates? And the political leaders respond, and they will often offer real world protection to these kind of growing universities just to keep them in town because the economic activity is so beneficial. It's the same thing you see with sports teams today. Right? Sports team says, I want a new stadium, and it's going to cost $1 billion, and I don't want to pay for it. So they go to the local mayor or a governor or county leaders or something, and they say, build me a stadium. And what happens if the politicians refuse?
They lose money
How do they lose money?
from
Yeah, the team picks up and they go somewhere else. All right? We've seen this happen cyclically over the last 20 years. When a city government says, no, we're not going to take $1 billion out of our schools and highways just to build you a stadium. That's stupid. That team will just pick up and go somewhere else to some city that will make that promise. Yeah, well, that was LA's problem 20 years ago. LA didn't want to build stadiums, or update stadiums at least, for the 2 local football teams, so they both picked up and left. And this has happened with baseball teams. It's happened with hockey teams. It happens all over the place. Because they know they have that economic threat. If the team picks up and goes somewhere else, this city just lost, thousands of jobs and construction projects and all kinds of things, right? And all the restaurants and bars and hotels around that stadium that doesn't have a team anymore, their business just disappeared. So it's an economic threat that you still see happening today. Just back then, it's with schools. So these university faculty are economically powerful, not because they are rich themselves, but because of the economic activity they bring to an area. And they start building themselves up almost like guilds, where if you study with a certain teacher for so many years, you can become like an independent thinker, which means you're a bachelor. And if you study even more, take more classes or write a thesis or something, you become a master of that topic. And the highest level, you can become a doctor of that topic, a doctor of philosophy, which is basically what a PhD is today. And they model that off of carpenters and master craftsmen, all kinds of different fields. Does that make sense? So they're becoming institutionalized. And they have all kinds of different regalia, and people with certain degrees get to wear certain kinds of clothes, and that's where you get all the graduation gowns and the hoods and all the little decorations and stuff. Because if you go back to the picture, you can see the teachers actually walk around in the university wearing that stuff with the cap and gown all the time. That's what differentiated them from the students. That one's obviously fallen by the wayside, except on graduation day, right? Alrighty. Let's see. So as these universities start growing, especially the secular ones, they start accessing especially ancient documents from ancient Greece and Rome. They kind of rediscover a lot of this stuff and they start reanalyzing it. So there's a growth in scholarship and kind of intellectual life in Europe starting in the 1000s. And a lot of textbooks call that scholasticism. And their general system becomes known as the dialectic, which basically means constructing logical arguments. So a lot of these schools are kind of like law schools today, where they have all this stuff that the students read, and the students have to construct arguments, and they hold debates. And they try to make them as purely dedicated to logical argument as possible, take out the emotion and all the logical fallacies and whatnot. And by the early 1100s, the guy that gets most famous for doing this, like one of the giant writers and teachers and whatnot, is named Peter Abelard. And he basically just attacks every logical system, trying to find its flaws, and just destroys every logical system he encounters. Which was really offensive to the church, because Abelard's approach was to attack every logical system. The church is one logical system. So a lot of church leaders saw Abelard's career as a giant attack against church doctrine. And so they went after him for that. So they basically ran an investigation on him and found out that he had secretly been married, which was a big kind of social problem at that time. So he had this mistress that he had secretly married, and they really attack him publicly for that. And he has to basically go to Rome and have an audience with the Pope to ask for forgiveness. And as he's traveling to that, he gets sick and dies. So that's the end of Peter Abelard. But a lot of the scholastic movement is almost entirely focused on these ancient texts. There's not a whole lot of creation of really newer ideas yet. And almost all of this is based in logical argument, logical attacks, and whatnot. Their favorite in medieval Europe is really Aristotle. when they rediscover Aristotle's ancient writings, they start relearning them and memorizing them and building all kinds of logical arguments off of his writings and logical constructions. And they really love Aristotle because he wrote a whole lot on all kinds of different topics. So he was, to them, like one of the great geniuses of all human history. And they tend to think that a lot of these ancient texts, especially Aristotle's, that they're perfect. That they're almost infallible. Which obviously creates problems for their own kind of development of new ideas if they're really just kind of almost intellectually worshiping stuff that's already been written down. Then all you have to do is memorize that stuff and understand it, and that's as far as you can go. So there really isn't a creation of a kind of new way of thinking or questioning yet in Europe. So this is not a scientific revolution looking for new data or observing evidence and coming up with new ideas. It is mostly memorizing what's already been done and understanding it. One problem for the church, though, is that Aristotle argued that the universe is eternal and without creation. Because Aristotle said that the universe is here, it must go way back, it'll last forever. It wasn't created by anything because that means that nothing had to create something. And Aristotle argued that that's kind of logically impossible. So what did the church interpret that as?
No creation.
Yeah. If there's no creation, there's no creator. There's no God. So the church didn't like Aristotle so much and tried to argue against all these Aristotle followers throughout the scholastic era. And one guy comes along. Basically, scholasticism was building up this conflict between Aristotle versus the church. And one guy comes along named Thomas Aquinas. And he's a member of the church, and he puts out this argument that that reason, logical argument, logic, the Aristotle method, and the church, faith, they are not enemies. They shouldn't be attacking each other. They shouldn't be harmful to each other. Aquinas argues that they're complementary. They work together. So you shouldn't be taking sides. You should be involved with both. And his giant quote is, reason, logic, starts you on a path that only faith can fulfill. They can start off with logical argument, but eventually you get to a point where you have to believe it. And he says that's where the role of religion comes in. So Aquinas got really famous for this theory. And after he died, the church makes him to a saint, so he's now known as Saint Thomas Aquinas. And the church eventually proclaims that Aquinas' argument is the theory that justifies the church's existence in the first place. So Aquinas is a big, big celebrity within Christian history. And after the 1500s, you get the split within Christianity where some people stick with the Pope's church and they become known as Catholics, Catholicism. And other groups protest the church and they go off and start their own movements. They become known as Protestants. So Aquinas is mostly powerful, has his argument within Catholicism today. But that split doesn't happen until the 1500s, so all of ancient European history or Western Civ, basically it's all unified Christianity. As you get further into the 1200s and into the 1300s, some scholars start questioning the dialectic, this logical construction. They basically argue that it's too dry, it's too unemotional, it's too textbook, basically. So they argue that, yeah, you'll take some students, and the ones that are just naturally really good at just understanding things by reading it from a book, understanding these abstract theories, they can deal with the dialectic pretty easily. But for a lot of other people out there in society, if they're not being trained in that kind of stuff, they're not going to understand any of these scholarly arguments, any of this intellectual stuff. So a new movement becomes humanism, which is basically you have to take the intellectual messages, the arguments, and you have to put them in stuff that general people can access and understand, like music or plays or poems, something that people kind of enjoy more popularly. Does that make sense? So today it would be like TV shows or music or films or something like that, where you go watch this movie because it's an entertaining movie, but it still has pieces of the dialectic argument in there. Does it make sense? To get the idea to the popular masses. So the dialectic is academic and very rigid, textbook-like, and humanism is more emotional, more popular.